Welcome, and peace be upon you. So I just finished defending theism for a change, which was a fun challenge. You can listen to the debate on Apologetics, or you can watch it on the Exploring Reality YouTube channel. I wanted to expand on those arguments just a little and anticipate some common objections to them. So you might ask, why are you spending even more time defending theism? Aren't you an atheist? Well, yes, but I have an even deeper commitment. A commitment to never, ever admitting that I might be wrong about something I said. So I want to defend those four arguments I raised in a little more detail, and also explain why I think they're not so overwhelming that I have to be a theist. So in the Devil's Advocate debate, which once again was hosted on the Exploring Reality YouTube channel, I debated Kyle Olander, or Christian Idealism on YouTube. He's a Catholic and he was defending atheism. I'm an atheist and I was defending theism. Even though there are certain models of God that I think are more plausible, process theism, the interesting Mormon model of God, which is a little more naturalistic, or even pantheism, or even leaving theism, aesthetic deism or something like that. Even though I do assign a higher credence to those models of God than I do to perfect being theism, I still chose to defend perfect being theism because I think it's more in the ballpark of what the average theist believes. So I defended a sort of bare philosophical theism, and the exact definition I used I'm sort of flexible on. I defined God as a necessary being who is perfectly loving, morally perfect, conscious, personal, and a being of infinite power at the foundation of reality. You can kind of alter those attributes a little bit and remain squarely within the realm of perfect being theism. So if you want to learn more about different models of God, then you can check out the content produced by Joe Schmid, Majesty of Reason, or Ryan Mullins. It's something I should probably know more about because when you alter your model of God, that changes the entailments and the predictions of the theory. If we're treating theism like a theory, like an explanation, which that is basically my approach, comparing theism and naturalism as competing explanations of the world, well then it really matters what your model is. It will yield different predictions and have different entailments depending on your model. So when you're assessing different arguments from evil, the arguments presented don't all count equally against all models of God. I don't see how you can change the model and then all of the evidence has exactly the same weight, has exactly the same impact that it did before. So it really matters, for instance, whether or not you think God can bring about any logically possible state of affairs. Or if, like Mormons, you think that God is sort of constrained by certain physical laws. If you think God created all of nature, or you think God is a part of nature, yeah, that makes a difference. But at any rate, I'm defending perfect being theism. So just to say a word about the methodology that I used for approaching this, I think I'm just using a standard sort of Draper-Swinburne approach. If you watch the video I made about Draper's debate with William Lane Craig, I'm basically using the same approach that he used in that debate. So he has this illustration that I think makes it easy to understand. So you have two jars of jelly beans, one is filled with mostly red beans and a small number of blue beans, the other is filled with mostly blue beans and a small number of red beans. And both jars also contain an equal number of yellow beans, so those are just kind of evidentially neutral. So we take a handful of beans from one of the jars and we don't know which one it is, and we have more of one color than the other. We have more red beans than blue beans or vice versa. So the evidence is compatible, it's consistent with the beans coming from either jar, but it's surprising on the assumption that they came out of one jar and unsurprising on the assumption that they came out of the other. So it's not that I think hiddenness is incompatible with theism, or psychophysical harmony is incompatible with atheism. It's just that, atheism assigns a higher probability to hiddenness than theism, and theism assigns a higher probability to psychophysical harmony than atheism. If we happened to draw majority blue beans, it's possible it came out of the jar with majority red beans, but the odds are against it. So the only way to do this is to assess the total evidence. You can't just hone in on a few blue beans or a few red beans. Unfortunately, that's what we had to do. It's not like we can settle the whole atheism versus theism thing in a YouTube debate. But I think it's still worthwhile to hone in on the blue beans or the red beans so you know what the full cumulative case would actually look like, what it would actually entail. So yeah, it's good to hone in on specific arguments and really work through them. So just to back up a step, by evidence, I mean that which makes a hypothesis more probable than it otherwise would have been without that evidence. I think an observation strongly favors theism over atheism if theism assigns to that observation a probability that is bigger than the probability that atheism assigns to that observation. So it's not that all conceivable data would be consistent with theism and consistent with atheism, but I think all the data that we have is consistent with both, it seems to me. But that doesn't change the fact that atheism assigns a higher probability to certain observations than theism does, so that observation is evidence favoring atheism. And vice versa. So the fact that we can explain all the data if we put our minds to it doesn't change the basic judgment that certain observations are more likely on theism than on atheism and vice versa. Something that Kyle emphasized in the debate was the role of simplicity as a theoretical virtue. And I agree that simplicity is a theoretical virtue, but when you're taking this kind of approach that I'm outlining here, I think the main role simplicity plays is in helping determine the prior probability of a hypothesis, or maybe deciding between two explanatorily equal hypotheses. But I don't think it really plays a decisive role in the case of atheism versus theism. I don't think it's the case that having a marginally simpler theory just inflates the prior probability. So atheism or naturalism or whatever is starting with such a head start that they'll never be overtaken. And I don't think that theism being less simple than naturalism just decimates its prior probability to the point that it could not be overcome, even with really strong evidence. So yeah, I mean, simplicity helps out in terms of prior probability, but I don't think it plays this overwhelming, decisive role. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at when I said, would it really be the case that your world would be turned upside down if the simplest theory wasn't the one that turned out to be true? Or when I was asking, is it really off limits to say, I don't care that you have a marginally simpler hypothesis? The point is that I don't think having a non-simple hypothesis eviscerates the prior probability so that, the conversation's over. You've got a less simple hypothesis. The prior probability is now so low that it can't be overcome. And besides, the whole simplicity thing, I mean, it's just a rule of thumb anyway. Sometimes the less simple hypothesis is the one that turns out to be true. Preferring simplicity is not an inviolable rule. Some people have a kind of aesthetic preference to have, as Quine said, a bare desert-like ontology. But I think it's pretty much just that. It's just an aesthetic preference. It's just an aesthetic preference to give it this exalted place where it's the main thing that you care about. I think simplicity's main role is just in determining the prior probability. Anyway, if I'm missing something, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Okay, so let's move on to the first argument, the existence of consciousness. So, consciousness is guaranteed to be a feature of the world if God exists, but it's not guaranteed to be a feature of the world if God doesn't exist. So the observation is just consciousness exists, or there's at least one conscious agent, or maybe the way I was just putting it is sort of more intuitive. Consciousness is a feature of our world. It's very easy to conceive of a world in which conscious beings never arise, but on theism, consciousness is guaranteed to be a feature of the world. Theism is incompatible with the non-existence of consciousness. Naturalism is compatible with the non-existence of consciousness. So consciousness as a feature of the world is an observation that favors theism over naturalism, because it's entailed by theism, it's not entailed by naturalism or atheism or the hypothesis of indifference. Therefore, theism assigns a higher probability to that observation, so it's evidence that favors theism. I mean, again, that's what evidence means. It means something that makes a hypothesis more likely than it otherwise would have been. It's something hypothesis 1 assigns a higher probability to relative to hypothesis 2. So, I think the best response to this argument is that it commits Draper's fallacy of understated evidence. Maybe this very general fact, consciousness is a feature of our world, yeah, maybe that favors theism over atheism, but maybe more specific facts on the same topic, consciousness, maybe that would favor atheism over theism. At least that's the common response. So is this evidence understated? Consciousness is guaranteed to be a feature of the world, in the broadest sense of the world. In other words, the global existing order of reality. The totality of being, if you want to be even more vague about it. But it's not guaranteed to be a feature of the world in the exact way that we observe. On theism, it's guaranteed to be a feature of the global order, but it's not guaranteed to be a feature of reality in the exact way we observe. So we're embodied creatures. Conscious states are correlated with physical brain states. That's absolutely true. So it seems like it might be understated evidence. But a key feature of understated evidence is that the excluded details are more expected on the competing hypothesis, or the excluded details, once factored in, undercut what was originally taken to be evidence, such that it no longer supports the hypothesis. So we'll talk more about this a little later, but one example of understated evidence is, imagine someone's accused of murder, the victim was murdered with a knife, and we find out that the accused bought a knife only 10 minutes before the murder. That could be part of a cumulative case against him. But this evidence is understated because there are more details about the knife that cut against the point being made. Anyway, the knife was a butter knife, and the murder was not committed with a butter knife. So, the facts about the evidence that are being excluded undercut the original evidence, since it's actually not supportive of the hypothesis that the accused committed the murder. That he bought a butter knife does not support that claim in any way. That's how understating the evidence works. And I'll say that I think that some evidence for theism is problematically understated, but I'm less sure that this is one of those cases. So what's supposed to be going on? Consciousness is guaranteed to be a feature of the global existing order of reality. Theism does entail a consciousness-involving world, but it's not guaranteed to be a feature of the world in the exact way we observe. We're embodied creatures, conscious states are correlated with physical states. Theism doesn't give us any reason to expect that. True enough, theism doesn't give us any reason to expect it, but neither does God's non-existence. And besides, how are these observations in conflict with theism? How do they undercut theism? Is it just the idea that there's a physical world at all? Is the existence of the physical world supposed to be that great of evidence against theism? Because I certainly don't see how correlations between physical brain states and phenomenal states, how is that in conflict with God exists? It doesn't really seem like the knife case. So I'm not sure why that matters or changes anything. Does atheism assign a higher probability to the existence of something called brains on which consciousness would be dependent? Okay, God doesn't exist. Now we can deduce that there is going to be some kind of weird, wet tissue mush, and if you mess around with the wet tissue, then consciousness will change corresponding along with it. Oh yeah, I can see how that follows straightforwardly from God doesn't exist. The knife turned out to be a yellow bean. At first it was supposed to be a red bean. It could be part of a cumulative case that the accused committed the murder. But once you stopped problematically understating the evidence, you saw that it was not a red bean, not a blue bean, but a yellow bean. It was evidentially neutral. The fact that the accused bought a butter knife 10 minutes before the murder does not support the idea that he's the murderer, and it doesn't detract from the idea that he's the murderer. So understated evidence can go either way. Once the evidence is no longer problematically understated, maybe it turns out to be a yellow bean, maybe it turns out to be a blue bean. Either way, it's understated evidence. But it seems like the details that are being offered, you're excluding these relevant details. And then they offer things that are seemingly irrelevant. The butter knife is a yellow bean. Imagine if someone just skipped to this part of the podcast. The butter knife is a yellow bean. When you understate the evidence, it sounds like a red bean. Now, with consciousness, it sounds like, just to stick with the theism, atheism thing, theism, that's supposed to be the blue beans. So I'm just going to stick to that. So I'm saying the observation, consciousness exists, or consciousness is a feature of our world, I'm saying that is a blue bean. The accusation is that it's problematically understated, and then people start adding details. It's true, I excluded those details, but I really don't see how they change anything. Oh, well, there are correlations between physical brain states and mental states. Yeah, so what? I mean, how does that change anything? It's like, oh, the defendant, he bought a knife, and then his lawyer, pounded the table and stood up and said, it didn't have a wooden handle, it had a plastic handle. It's like, okay, you're right that I excluded those details. I'm not sure how they change anything. And by the way, I'm not saying this as like an open challenge, like, oh, no one has ever elaborated why they think that correlations between physical brains and our minds, like, oh, no one has ever explained why they think that supports atheism. No, people have tried. Like, there are arguments from physical minds. And sometimes theists will just kind of talk about the hard problem of consciousness like it's a problem for atheism. No, this is very common. But the idea that physicalism versus non-physicalism is some kind of proxy war between atheism and theism, I just think that that's a product of the times that we happen to live in. Like, I don't think there's any essential connection between atheism and physicalism. And not that this proves the point, but I think it is worth noting, nonetheless, that many, if not most, of the prominent non-physicalist philosophers of our time are atheists. David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, Noam Chomsky, and just well-known atheists from history. Bertrand Russell, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. I saw a news article from, I think, over 100 years ago. There was some famous physicist who said, I don't know a single physicist who's not an idealist. A lot of things in philosophy of mind, they're just kind of cultural trends. They're just kind of these ephemeral, contingent, non-rational social trends. Materialism has been having its moment in the sun. I think that's finally coming to an end. It's not because we did more science and then, we realized idealism was wrong. Oh gosh, we've collected so much evidence against idealism in the intervening 100 years. No, that's not at all what happened. But yeah, Planck, Schrödinger, de Broglie, non-physicalism was pretty common among really important physicists. I don't know what Einstein thought. I know he was a spinozist. There are others that are escaping me right now, but anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. I just mean, I don't really see how more specific facts about consciousness really favor theism over atheism. So back to the argument at hand, the objection, the accusation of understating the evidence, as I understand it, is something like, well, theism predicts that consciousness will exist, but it doesn't predict that we would exist. Okay, but the fact that we exist is not evidence against theism. So how is this understated evidence? If this was understated evidence, then what should happen is that when you include the further details, it should become clear why the apparently blue bean is actually just a yellow bean, or maybe even a red bean. But that hasn't happened. It's clearly not like the case of the knife. I think that the initial reaction of like, oh, this is understated evidence. Yeah, that sounds plausible enough. I just would like to hear a little more about it. To quote Jeff Lauder, who, if you don't know, is the atheist who came up with this argument, while theism does not entail human consciousness exists, theism does entail consciousness exists, because theism entails that God exists and God is conscious, by definition. In contrast, naturalism is compatible with the non-existence of consciousness. So the existence of human consciousness, while not entailed by theism, isn't surprising on theism, in the way it is on naturalism. In that sense, human consciousness is evidence favoring theism over naturalism. End quote. So on theism, consciousness has already been admitted into our ontology. And theism is compatible with the non-existence of human consciousness, but it's not compatible with the non-existence of consciousness. Naturalism is compatible with the non-existence of both. It's very easy to imagine consciousness just not being a feature of our world. Yeah, there are certain forms of naturalism that entail that consciousness will be a feature of the world, like idealism and panpsychism, or maybe even physicalism and the conjunction of other hypotheses that would make it so consciousness is kind of inevitable, or maybe even something like natural teleology. I don't think Thomas Nagel believes that consciousness is fundamental, but he thinks that it arising was inevitable. Well, fundamental is tricky there. I mean that Nagel, even though he's sympathetic to panpsychism, he's sort of a fellow traveler. He doesn't think that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, even though he does think it's irreducible. As far as I know, Jeff Lauder still endorses this argument. He calls it the F-inductive argument from consciousness for theism. So I think the worst thing you could say about this argument is, A, just that it's understated evidence, but I would want to hear more specifics about why that is, because usually when someone says that, they start talking about physicalism, and I don't think that physicalism or dualism or whatever, I really don't think that these sorts of ideas favor theism or atheism. And B, I think you could say this evidence is just really weak. It doesn't really move the needle that much. So I don't know, maybe it is just really weak evidence favoring theism, but I think it definitely is evidence favoring theism. So the second argument I raised was psychophysical harmony, and by my lights, this was my main argument. So in a nutshell, our nature as conscious beings is partially or wholly dependent on laws of nature, laws which are ontologically prior to natural selection, and laws which conceivably could have varied in dramatic ways. So that means our nature as conscious beings conceivably could have been dramatically different in ways that would have been incredibly disharmonious and disvaluable. So we have these correlations between functional roles and subjective experiences, and these have been matched up kind of harmoniously. The functional roles have been correlated with subjective experiences that make sense of that functional role. Our subjective experiences justify and rationalize those functional roles. So even if you're a physicalist and you think there's some kind of a posteriori identification between physical states and mental states, this problem still applies to you. The physical brain states could have been identified with different subjective experiences that did not rationalize or justify or make sense of the functional states. And this applies if you're a dualist, it applies if you're a panpsychist. You just have to imagine the physical world remaining fixed while the internal phenomenal world is just radically different. So at first you might think this requires epiphenomenalism, because how could it be the case that your internal world is one way and the external world is exactly the same, unless the internal world is causally inert? So to preserve mental causation and get to this disharmonious state, you have to appeal to these fundamental laws that are ultimately responsible for correlating the phenomenal and physical states. This couldn't take place in our universe. You'd have to have a different universe with different fundamental laws. So to get out of this argument, you might think, well, I could argue that our psychophysical laws are necessary, that they couldn't have varied. And Dustin and I covered this in the conversation we had. It's also something you can read about in their paper, in Dustin Crummett and Brian Cutter's paper, Psychophysical Harmony. It's still epistemically possible that the laws could have varied, leading to these disharmonious states where we've got the physical world that's, basically the same, but you've got an internal world that's chaotic or hellish as a consequence of the non-finely tuned psychophysical laws. So it's epistemically possible that those laws could have varied, and epistemic possibilities can be assigned probabilities. You can make this point abstractly, but I think that a concrete example can help make more sense of it. This is what made it clear to me, at least. So imagine that necessitarianism is true. Literally nothing could have been otherwise than it is right now. So say we look up at the sky, and in the stars it says, "I'm the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus Christ is Lord," or something. And we discover that that's written in the stars in 20 different languages. So the question is, does the necessitarian have to change their credence in theism? If you're saying no, that's completely crazy. Like the idea, I think it's necessary that the stars would have that arrangement. It's completely unavoidable. Okay, but still, you could conceive of the stars not saying, I'm the Alpha and the Omega in 20 different languages. You can conceive of that not being the case. So even if you just say, it's necessary. Okay, well, it clearly is evidence favoring theism. This message in the stars is definitely evidence favoring theism. We would not expect stars to have that kind of arrangement on atheism. It is very unexpected. So yeah, you don't get out of that being evidence just because you say, I think it was necessary. It couldn't have varied. Okay, well, that doesn't change the fact that this would be evidence favoring theism over atheism. So again, you can cash that out more abstractly, but I would encourage you just to read the paper. They're going to put it better than I could. But yeah, that example really made it clear to me. So yeah, things conceivably could have been disharmonious. So you can imagine a world where the internal phenomenal world is chaotic or hellish, otherwise disharmonious, and the physical world is basically as it is. So yeah, that would be bad for us. And as they argue in the paper, the number of disharmoniously tuned universes is vastly greater than the number of harmonious universes. So it's not like indifference can really help with this. The hypothesis of indifference is good at predicting a mixed bag, a mix of value and disvalue. But in this specific case, it's not like a 50-50 chance that we would have harmony or disharmony. Even so, this argument would still be interesting, but as it turns out, the number of disharmoniously tuned universes is vastly greater than the number of harmonious universes. There are more ways in which things could have gone wrong than they could have gone right. Again, there are some potential snags here, and I would just recommend the paper. It's kind of a long paper, it's kind of technical, but it's still very interesting, and it covers a lot of interesting philosophical ground that has relevance beyond the argument. Anyway, the point is, on indifference, we won the cosmic lottery. But if foundational reality is not indifferent to realizing value or disvalue, if it has a tendency to realize value, then that assigns a higher probability to the observation of psychophysical harmony than indifference. So this is good evidence favoring theism. So there are some potential responses to this that I think are okay. I'm curious about this whole revenge problem. Does some psychophysical harmony also apply to God? God's mind. So he doesn't have physical states, but he does have, he is a conscious being. And psychophysical harmony isn't just about the harmonious relation between physical states and mental states. It's about the harmonious relation between mental states with other mental states. So you could imagine disharmony here where one experience just naturally leads to another experience, but it just makes no sense. It's just chaotic or hellish, So God being a conscious being, does that mean that some subset of psychophysical harmony also applies to him? I don't see how it wouldn't. So to answer that, you'd have to dig into your model of God and try to come up with some kind of explanation for why God's mind is harmonious. Now, there's less of a problem with psychophysical harmony for God's mind than our minds, because once again, unless you're a Mormon, God is not a physical being. Okay, so how would I respond to this argument? Because I'm still an atheist, and I'm singing the praises of this argument. It's really powerful evidence. I'm saying, oh my God, we won the cosmic lottery. Okay, well, that's not a very good explanation, so how am I still an atheist? Well, as is acknowledged in the paper, this evidence is underdetermined, meaning it's equally supportive of many different hypotheses. It supports aesthetic deism, the idea that there's a deistic God who has these aesthetic preferences, who wants there to be a great story, who wants there to be genuine triumph and tragedy, wants interesting things to happen. And in order to have an interesting story, you have to have some degree of harmony. And maybe that would even do a good job of explaining the disharmony that we see. It's not like we're frolicking in a perfectly harmonious wonderland here. Like, there is some psychophysical disharmony, but it's swamped by the harmony once you grasp the immense range of potentially disharmonious scenarios. So this could be evidence for aesthetic deism. It's equally supportive of aesthetic deism. You'd have to decide between theism and aesthetic deism on other grounds. Psychophysical harmony is also equally good evidence for cosmopsychist axiarchism, the idea that there's a fundamental tendency to realize value. And that idea is similarly embedded in Thomas Nagel's natural teleology. There's a natural tendency to realize value. So you'd have to decide between Thomas Nagel's worldview and theism on other grounds. You'd have to make a comparison between, Thomas Nagel's worldview and Dustin Crumit's worldview, and you'd have to decide on other grounds, or Philip Goff's cosmopsychism, which includes axiarchism. If you've never heard of that before, there's an Eon article that he wrote that kind of explains it. And he also had a conversation with Josh Rasmussen where they kind of debated the merits of theism versus cosmopsychism. So the point is that psychophysical harmony is equally good evidence for other ideas that are non-theistic: aesthetic deism, natural teleology, and axiarchism, to name a few. And yeah, I'm interested in axiarchism. I'm interested in natural teleology. Now, that is definitely not the end of the conversation. You can't just say, oh, I like axiarchism, and then dust off your hands. You've got to flesh that out, and it's no easy task. There are unique challenges. I mean, once you go down this road, you kind of have to reinvent some things, right? Because you're not really in the ballpark of the hypothesis of indifference anymore. Not really. And, I like appealing to indifference, to support atheism over theism in general. So if I really want to go down this path, instead of just kind of flirting with it and being interested in it, like I have been, then I would possibly have to re-examine my case for atheism more generally. I mean, to solve the problem of psychophysical harmony, you need something that can give you a tendency to produce harmony, something that would bias the outcome towards a subset of possible worlds. Natural selection does not seem up for this particular task, and that's why I think you need some kind of out-of-the-box answers. But hey, I'm totally open-minded on this. I would love to hear about a solution that doesn't involve something that would dramatically alter the character of our worldview. But, it's not the end of the world if that turns out to be the case. But anyway, you need something that can give you a tendency to produce harmony. Something that would make a subset of valuable possible worlds more likely, but perhaps not too likely, but still more likely than the others. So I would just say this is not to be taken lightly. However, you can fully accept the argument from psychophysical harmony and not be a theist. So, both of the arguments we discussed have something in common. A subset of forms of naturalism are uniquely capable of handling both lines of evidence. The evidence, both in the case of consciousness and psychophysical harmony, is underdetermined. It's equally supportive of multiple hypotheses, theistic and non-theistic. But if we're keeping it at the level of generality, of theism versus naturalism, then we have to take into account that basically every type of theism can account easily for psychophysical harmony, and basically every form of theism entails that consciousness exists. Whereas only some forms of naturalism entail that consciousness exists, and only some forms of naturalism can easily account for psychophysical harmony. And for both, we'd have to go more into the realm of what Felipe Leon calls liberal naturalism. So if we're just comparing theism and naturalism without qualification, then both lines of evidence do favor theism. It's true that subcategories of naturalism will be able to predict the evidence just as well, and assign an equal probability, at least, to what we're observing as theism. So it can be done, but it's still correct to say that these two lines of evidence militate against naturalism, if we're talking about naturalism versus theism, and not taking it past that stage. Between certain forms of naturalism and theism, the evidence doesn't favor either one. It's a draw. Psychophysical Harmony is equally supportive of theism and of some non-theistic models as well. For independent reasons, I was already interested in some of these non-theistic ideas that stray from the more standard forms of naturalism. So they have independent motivation in my mind, and they happen to help, potentially, in these two areas of consciousness and psychophysical harmony. So it's not really a problem for atheism exactly. There are forms of naturalism, liberal naturalism, let's say, that have no trouble handling this evidence, or at least no more trouble than theists. So yeah, it's an interesting problem of worldview comparison. I mean, once you get more specific, you take on a heavier burden for yourself. So it would be nice if naturalism, like theism, could handle this evidence without any fuss, but we're not really in naturalism's wheelhouse right now. If we were trying to explain evil or hiddenness, then we would easily have the upper hand and theists would be in this position. You don't need to start invoking, I don't want to say ancillary hypotheses, but you don't have to start invoking things that go beyond naturalism versus theism simpliciter. If you're trying to explain evil or hiddenness on naturalism, it's really easy. Whereas on theism, you have to start getting into the weeds pretty quickly. So when it comes to these two lines of evidence, it's the naturalist who has to take on a heavier burden. You know, I have no trouble admitting that there is some evidence against my position. I mean, like, how crazy would it be if there was zero evidence against my worldview? Like, literally none. Of course there's some evidence against your position, no matter what it is. So yeah, I mean, there is some evidence for theism. I think that the case for atheism is better, obviously. That's why I'm an atheist. And I actually do want to do this sort of thing I'm doing right now in defense of atheism. Like, I want to work on a short, cumulative case for naturalism that I'd present in a debate setting and see where that goes. So that's what I'm working on next, after I'm done expanding on this devil's advocate case for theism. But yeah, I mean, you should be able to admit that there is some evidence against your position. I don't know, I just find that some people have a very hard time admitting that there is literally any evidence against what they believe. You know, on both the theistic and atheistic side. But the world is ambiguous, man. I know I'm not the first to tell you. Okay, so now we're at widespread theistic belief, or the common consent argument. I've decided to die upon this hill, because I think this is actually a good argument and it's underappreciated. I also like how it's sort of an appeal to common sense. You know, like the last argument can get really technical really quickly, as soon as you get in the weeds, but this argument is just kind of squarely in the realm of common sense, so I like that about it. So the basic point is just that most of the beliefs that answer to the kind of description we can give to theism, most of those beliefs are true. So what I mean by that is, if human faculties overwhelmingly tend to produce belief in X, and most human beings today and throughout history believed in X, if it's been a constant throughout human existence as best we can tell, both in the past and in the present, the vast majority of humans believe X, then X is probably true. So let's try formulating this into an argument. Premise 1, if a belief is held by most people, past and present, then that belief is probably true. Premise 2, theistic belief has been held by most people, past and present. Therefore, theism is probably true. So that conclusion seems a bit strong. Maybe it should have like an other things held equal clause or something like that. But as you know, I prefer to put things in the kind of form like, hey, here's an observation. This observation is more likely on this hypothesis as compared to that hypothesis. It assigns a higher probability to this observation than the rival hypothesis. Therefore, this observation favors the first over the second. But it's still helpful to put things in that kind of deductive form, so that way it's really clear, you know, like, here's a premise, here's another premise, here's the conclusion that follows. There are basically two things you can do now. Either say the conclusion doesn't follow, so it's an invalid argument, or you can attack one of the two premises. So, what can be said in support of those two premises? Premise 1, if a belief is held by most people, past and present, then that belief is probably true. Okay, so why think that? Well, most of the beliefs that are held by most people, past and present, are true, and there's a reason for that. We have generally trustworthy cognitive faculties, so if they overwhelmingly produce the same result, we have, at the very least, a good reason to take that belief seriously. And this premise just becomes transparently obvious once we start to reflect on the long list of beliefs that answer to this description. So this is why I brought up the Michael Huemer quote from the book Knowledge, Reality, and Value. And you know what? I'm just going to read it again. This is currently in the running for most quoted passage on this podcast because I read it during the Logical Fallacies episode when I was making the point that ad populum, or the bandwagon fallacy, is not really a fallacy, or at least something that sounds a lot like the bandwagon fallacy or the argument from popularity, is really not fallacious. And I also read it during the debate. Quote, ad populum is the fallacy of believing something because most people believe it. But what exactly is supposed to be wrong with that? Maybe the idea is that most people believing P is irrelevant to whether P is true. In other words, if most people believe it, that doesn't mean it's more likely to be correct. Problem. This is obviously wrong. If most people believe something, that obviously does make it more likely to be correct than if most people don't believe it. If most of our beliefs weren't true, the human species would die out pretty much immediately. Sometimes people elaborate on this fallacy by citing examples of beliefs that were once widely held but were false. For example, that the sun orbits the Earth. So let me now just mention a few typical examples of beliefs that are widely held. Dogs exist. It is generally lighter in the daytime than at night. The sky is blue, not red, green, or yellow. There are more than 3 human beings in existence. Human beings commonly have beliefs and desires. Putting your hand in a fire hurts. 6 is more than 2. The Earth has existed for more than 5 minutes. When you drop rocks near the surface of the Earth, they generally fall. I'm sure you can extend that list for a long time. Now, which would you say there are more of? Widely held beliefs that are true, or ones that are false? End quote. So the first premise might sound a little weird at first, but the objections to it are weak. It's sort of like asking, why think that if someone plays the lottery, they're probably going to lose? Well, because most people who play the lottery lose. Okay, so what can be said in defense of premise 2? Theistic belief has been held by most people, past and present. So there's an article about the common consent argument that I've seen referenced whenever the argument comes up by this guy named Tiddy Smith, awesome name. And he sort of disputes that we're naturally disposed to believe in God, but I would point to the Cognition, Religion, and Theology project. This was led by Dr. Justin Barrett from the Center for Anthropology and Mind at Oxford University. Quote, a 3-year international research project directed by 2 academics at the University of Oxford finds that humans have natural tendencies to believe in gods and an afterlife. And it, quote, involved 57 researchers who conducted over 40 separate studies in 20 countries, representing a diverse range of cultures. The studies, both analytical and empirical, conclude that humans are predisposed to believe in gods and an afterlife. So, yeah, I mean, according to this major research endeavor, humans have a natural tendency to believe in gods. I think that if you could show that most people didn't believe in God throughout history, and it was sort of a belief that was taught, and indoctrinated and spread through force, that's something that Smith was trying to argue, which he purports to show, but I don't think he succeeds. If you could show that, belief in God is something that's more recent in human history, then that would undercut the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. If it was just the case that most people don't even have the relevant concepts. So he claims to have shown that, but as I said, I don't think he did. And certainly the Cognition, Religion, and Theology project seems like pretty powerful evidence in support of the idea that human beings do have a natural tendency to believe in God. Yeah, so their conclusion was that humans have a natural propensity to believe in God and the afterlife, not that we lack the relevant concepts until we're taught or indoctrinated. We're naturally inclined to believe in God. At the very least, the common consent argument should get you to take belief in God seriously and not think that it's on par with Santa Claus or unicorns or something like that. That's the modest aim of the argument. You could also frame this as an inference to the best explanation. Theistic belief is very widespread, and God's existence is a good explanation of why theistic belief is widespread. Competing explanations of the prevalence and persistence of belief in God are not as good as the straightforward theistic explanation. That's another way of doing it. I think that has something going for it. Why do most people believe in God? Well, one simple way of explaining it is that God exists. Why do most people believe that the external world exists, and that 6 is more than 2, and that putting your hand in a fire hurts, and that dogs exist, and that there are more than 3 human beings, and that other minds exist? Because that's all true. That it's true should be part of a good explanation of why most people believe it. Pretty straightforward. So again, if nothing else, this should get you to take theism seriously and not treat it like a delusion or a mental illness. The universal acceptance of the divine across cultures and times should maybe get you to think that the vast majority of humans who have ever existed are onto something, and maybe the atheist is the one who's missing something. So as I said, I think this argument is not bad, even though it's almost never, ever used by theists. But I mean, once you lay it out, I don't really see what's wrong with those premises. As I said, I only want to frame this as like a probability raising sort of argument. Like, hey, theism is more probable than it would have been if most people didn't believe it. And I think the way that I've framed this has kind of precluded any kind of self-defeat objection. Most people don't use the common consent argument. Most people don't think it's good. Well, first of all, most people don't know about the argument. It's not like belief that the common consent argument is bad is a belief that was held by most people, past and present. It's just been a constant throughout human history. No, it's not like that. Among the dorks like me and the people listening to this who have heard of this argument, most of them are not impressed. But again, the way that I framed the argument, I don't think that fact should be a problem. And, second of all, it's just like, hey, what's the problem with the argument? Both of these premises seem true to me. What's wrong with them? I mean, the fact is that human faculties overwhelmingly tend to produce belief in something godlike. Human faculties are generally truth-tracking. And just as a matter of probability, most of the beliefs that are held by most people are true. Once you start listing them out, it becomes abundantly clear that most of the beliefs that are held by most people are true. It's not irrelevant if most people don't believe something. I mean, think about it this way. What if everyone was an atheist, just naturally, and it was a constant throughout human history? You could find traces of theism here and there in history, but it was just a fringe of weirdos who believed it. Do you think that would, kind of alter your assessment of the likelihood of theism if most people didn't believe it and never had? Of course it would. Again, this is perfectly rational. There's nothing irrational about this. So maybe you could say the same thing about this argument as you could about the existence of consciousness. Oh, this is only very weak evidence for theism. Okay, fine. I mean, let's just start there. Let's just start by admitting that the argument works and that it's only very weak evidence. And then maybe over time you'll become convinced that it's maybe a little stronger than you'd initially supposed. So one common reply to this is a sort of general principle about the consensus of experts. If common sense leads most people to conclusion A, but those with relevant expertise come to conclusion B, that fact would provide a defeater for the support initially offered by widespread acceptance. Yeah, I think that's true, if our common sense and intuitions lead us to believe one thing about, physics or something, and then physicists come along and say, actually, that's wrong. I think most people are like, oh, okay. They're not like, fuck you. So who are the epistemic authorities here? So you might point out that there's an inverse correlation between education and religiosity. The question here is one of relevant expertise. So I don't really care what climate scientists think about philosophy of mind, or what economists think about photography. So just having a nondescript degree I don't think makes you an epistemic authority on God. I don't see why I should place any particular emphasis on your opinion about theism versus atheism because you have some nondescript degree. So I don't really care that there's an inverse correlation between education and religiosity, at least as it relates to this specific argument. So one might point out that there's an inverse correlation between education in philosophy and religiosity. The majority of philosophers don't believe in God. Okay, but again, the question is one of relevant expertise. Why should we place any emphasis on what philosophers of language think about God? Furthermore, there's this interesting article from Quinton Smith called The Metaphilosophy of Naturalism, where he basically says, like, yeah, most academics are atheists, but they're only accidentally right. They're literally just right by accident. He says, quote, "The great majority of naturalist philosophers have an unjustified belief that naturalism is true and an unjustified belief that theism is false." End quote. Quinton Smith was a leading atheist philosopher himself, and he did not respect the atheism of his peers, which was, was and still is like the predominant view in academic philosophy. And he was like, yeah, if they're right by accident. They are not people who you should look to when it comes to atheism versus theism. As it turns out, the majority of philosophers of religion are theists. So the subgroup of philosophers with the most plausible claim to relevant expertise are mostly theists. So you might think that selection pressure could explain why most philosophers of religion are theists. Atheists are probably less inclined to study something that they don't think is real in the first place. And I think that that's totally plausible, but it just doesn't really bear on the argument because I was never appealing to the consensus of experts anyway. I'm appealing to widespread acceptance among all human beings, past and present. I wasn't saying, hey, the experts, God exists, experts say. No, I don't care about it. That was never the argument. If you were trying to identify experts, the ones with the most plausible claim to it are actually mostly theists, so that doesn't really help either. And for what it's worth, if you were to identify experts, quote unquote, in this area, I think it would just be people who care the most about this issue and who have the relevant tools for assessing it. So I think it would be people with philosophical training, but more importantly, I think it would have to be people who really care about this issue. They care enough about it to read about it and to talk about it and argue about it. Who are approaching it in good faith. The problem is it's hard to poll for that. But yeah, I think that if you really care about what the answer is, your opinion matters more. It should be weighted more heavily than someone who barely cares about the subject, even if they're otherwise really smart and, well educated and so forth. So yeah, education matters, education in philosophy matters, but the set of people who have the relevant tools for assessing this and who really care about the answer, that set is much bigger than people who are in academic philosophy. So I do grant more weight to some people's opinion, but I don't really know how to test for those things that I said.
Of course, now the atheist may say, yeah, everybody comes up with a belief in religion or the transcendent, but they're all very different. So how could you say there is a corresponding object when you've got Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity? They all view God or the divine very differently. And my reply to that would be, well, imagine you're at a party with 100 people. And 95 of them say they heard a loud noise outside, but they disagree about the noise. Some say it was a voice, some say it was an explosion. 95 say there was a sound, but they disagree on what the sound was. And 5 of them say there was no sound at all. I would say in that case, it would be more likely there was a sound, and the 95 have incorrectly understood what it was, but there still was something out there. I'm not inclined to believe the 5 people who didn't hear it just because the 95 disagree.
Okay, so by far the most common response to this, though, is religious disagreement. This goes way beyond the common consent argument. So this is not all just in service of the argument from widespread theistic belief. We're also digging into, I think, a major evidential chip in favor of naturalism that happens to work as well as an objection to one of the arguments I raised. For one, it's offered as a defeater for widespread theistic belief and for religious experience. Secondly, it's a good argument in its own right. Okay, so widespread theistic belief is a genuine phenomenon, but the agreement is rather superficial. We're including Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and pagans and polytheists. Okay, so the widespread belief in God, it's actually pretty superficial. As soon as you scratch the surface, the more specific facts undermine any one particular theistic model. Again, this evidence is understated. And by the way, there's a difference between underdetermination and understating the evidence. I've been using both of those. I hope I haven't misspoken at any point, but underdetermination is just when evidence is equally supportive of multiple hypotheses. Understated evidence is when you hone in on some fact about the data that supports your hypothesis and ignore more specific data about the same subject that undermines your hypothesis. So Paul Draper gives the example of someone who's on trial for murder. The prosecution points out that 10 minutes before the stabbing murder took place, the defendant bought a knife. Okay, well, that seems like, decent evidence. It might raise your credence in the idea that they were the killer, but they neglect to mention that they bought a butter knife. He did not buy a knife of the stabbing variety. So, general fact sounds like it supports your hypothesis. More specific fact actually undermines it. So that's the fallacy of understated evidence. And presumably that's what the people who bring up religious disagreement are getting at. Yeah, there's widespread belief in God, but when you look at it more specifically, there's all this disagreement. Well, the thing that I pointed out in the debate, which I think is right, and is supported by the Cognition, Religion, and Theology Project, is that we have a natural tendency to believe in something godlike. That's my only point. I'm just arguing for something godlike. If you say this isn't evidence for, the Trinity, this is just evidence that something godlike exists, like, I'll take it. Deal. Okay, so we've got evidence that something godlike exists. You'll get this sometimes with like contingency arguments or cosmological arguments where someone will say like, oh, well, this doesn't prove that Jesus Christ is... It's like, yeah, it's not supposed to. It's a stage 1 contingency argument. I don't think you can actually say that's like a flaw of the argument because it's not supposed to do that. There are different stages of the case for theism. So I think the stage we're at when we're arguing about widespread theistic belief is just something godlike. That's it. So bringing up religious disagreement, I think, is no more a point against widespread theistic belief or the common consent argument than cosmological or contingency arguments. I mean, could this same point be raised against the Kalam? But it seems like the same kind of move, right? It's like just not understanding the stage of the case that we're in. Maybe the Kalam thing's not a perfect analogy, but the point is, the target belief is God, something godlike. If there were widespread Platonic agreement, everyone throughout history and in the present agreed that Platonism was true, but everyone was disunited about details concerning the Platonic realm, there would still be widespread Platonic agreement. I could think of other cases where people do have disagreements about the specific details, which of course might undermine any one hypothesis, but they're all kind of in the same X-like territory. If you went to a concert and you got wildly different reports about what was on stage, but they all agreed it was something band-like that was on stage, would that undermine the idea that there was a concert? So let's say that you're trying to figure out whether this concert really took place. You talk to 5 different people and you get 5 different answers about which band was on stage. So they all agree that there was something concert-like, but they disagree about which band was playing the show. Okay, well, does that undermine the idea that there was something concert-like? I mean, maybe, but does it undermine the idea that any one of those particular bands is the right answer? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. Is it reasonable to turn around and say there was no concert? It's one way of reading it. I mean, it just doesn't seem clear to me that, like, unambiguously that's the right way to read it. There was no concert. Let's say 95% of philosophers and philosophers of mind were physicalists, but some of them were illusionists, some of them were identity theorists, some of them were functionalists. There was this divide between a priori and a posteriori physicalism. There were all these crisscrossing dividing lines within the physicalist camp. Okay, but there's still widespread physicalist agreement. It's not a perfect analogy because we're just talking about philosophers, but still. You could still accurately say that there's widespread agreement that physicalism is true among philosophers. So again, the target belief is God, something godlike. We're not trying to prove the triune God or something like that, or Thor, or Allah, or any specific God. It's just something godlike. We're really not trying to get more specific than that. In the devil's advocate debate, I was just defending kind of a bare philosophical theism. So if I were making a cumulative case for theism, or for some particular version of theism, it would probably start with a contingency argument. Then I would make the kind of case that I made in the devil's advocate debate. And then if I was trying to argue for Christianity, I would have to make completely different arguments. So if you're making a sort of progressive cumulative case, there are going to be different stages of that case. First, you might be establishing just a necessary being and a foundation to reality. And then you move on to what the characteristics of that foundation might be. And then you try to support something vaguely theistic. And you gradually move along into something, specifically Christian. And if you wanted to get really specific, you'd start arguing for, Catholicism over Protestantism or something. So there could be many, many stages to the case for whatever your worldview happens to be, but it's not going to come all at once. Hey, so I'm in the middle of editing this right now, and I thought it might be helpful to step in and kind of give a roadmap. So as I said a moment ago, widespread theistic agreement is often met with the counterpoint, oh, but there's religious diversity. And I think that would be a great point if I was trying to make an argument from widespread Christian agreement, but I'm not. I'm making an argument from widespread theistic agreement. So there could be widespread physicalist agreement, and you could counter that there are illusionists and identity theorists and functionalists who don't agree. Okay, but the point is that there's widespread physicalist agreement. Now I'm moving on to another criticism, which is often implicit. It's not always drawn out explicitly. Namely that religious disagreement is special. It's not like other disagreements. So I try to draw out why I think it's unique and outline some potential responses. So the reason I wanted to interject with a roadmap is because I think I didn't make it sufficiently clear what I was doing. What I'm trying to do is make religious disagreement like any other kind of disagreement. So I think religious disagreement, prima facie, is special. There are things that make it distinctive. But I think that if you can succeed in making religious disagreement just like any other disagreement, over Platonism or something like that, then the evidence becomes less powerful. Whatever God's reasons are for allowing disagreement of any kind can explain why he permits religious diversity. I think if we can erode what makes religious disagreement distinctive and make it just like any other disagreement, then I think that that would go a long way towards undercutting or rebutting this kind of objection. So the three things that I key in on that I think make religious disagreement distinctive: God is trying to tell us the right answer. It's not like the Platonic realm is trying to tell us that the Platonic realm exists, but God is trying to communicate with us. Secondly, the stakes are high. It's as if we have a vast series of buttons in front of us, and if we press the wrong one, we end up being annihilated or suffering eternally, and God wasn't very clear about which button you're supposed to press. Okay, so the stakes are high. And then thirdly, a relationship with God is supposed to be good in and of itself. So if you're not in a relationship with God, you're missing out on something valuable. So whether or not you think that's what makes religious disagreement distinctive from other kinds of disagreement, or whether you think I succeed in undermining those 3 points, hopefully it's at least clear what the strategy is. So if I can undermine the second and third points, the stakes are not high, there will not be an unimaginable catastrophe that results from religious disagreement, and you will not be missing out on a relationship with God as a result of religious disagreement. I think that would undercut the first reason, God is trying to communicate with us. I think these 3 reasons are kind of bound up. He doesn't want there to be this level of diversity. Anyway, once you diminish religious disagreement to the same level as any other kind of disagreement, then the benefits of disagreement can come to the fore. What are the virtues of allowing disagreement? So maybe that would go a little way towards answering why there's religious diversity. Anyway, that's the plan. That's why I spend so much time talking about the afterlife and soteriology, and a little bit of time talking about hiddenness. Though this is all very cursory, it's more of an outline of a strategy for dealing with religious disagreement. So I brought up soteriology in the debate. Soteriology is just the branch of theology dealing with salvation and the afterlife. So I brought this up not only in the context of hiddenness and evil, but also in the context of religious diversity and disagreement. I mean, I think any complete discussion of religious disagreement is going to have to include some kind of soteriological discussion as well. So I did mention something like universalism, without getting too specific about which model of universalism. I was basically just saying no to eternal conscious torment and annihilationism. So there are a few points that I want to cover with regard to soteriology and universalism. The first has to do with the point that was just raised about the cumulative case, and how in the context of this devil's advocate debate, I wasn't really trying to get past the theistic stage, and yet now I'm talking about competing doctrines of salvation. When I was appealing to universalism, I was trying to draw it out from the more foundational stuff that I was talking about, perfect being theism. I wasn't appealing to, Christian scriptures or something. You could make a sort of common consent argument for the afterlife. It would actually be a lot stronger than the common consent argument for God. But I'm saying working with nothing but the tools of perfect being theism, if you're trying to answer the question of, is there an afterlife? Seems like you would lean yes. And what is the general character of this afterlife? Seems like you would lean positive. I mean, prima facie, it seems like an eternal, non-torturous afterlife for all conscious beings makes for a better fit with perfect being theism than creating conscious beings for a short time and then annihilating them, or creating them only to be tortured for all of eternity. Something like eternal conscious torment is logically incompatible with perfect being theism. Something like annihilation doesn't really make for a comfortable fit. Killing something because you love it is a kind of a weird thing to do. It became necessary to destroy the town to save it. I'm saying if you're trying to figure out yes afterlife or no afterlife, which would be more valuable? I would say yes afterlife. So if you're just talking about perfect being theism, which one makes for a more comfortable immediate fit? Well, I mean, just intuitively, it seems like thumbs up afterlife is better than thumbs down to the afterlife. And what is the general character of this afterlife? Positive or negative? Well, I think we can rule out, the more hellish ones. If you're trying to answer the question of, is there an afterlife? Seems like you would lean yes. And what is the general character of this afterlife? Seems like you would lean positive. Appealing to something like universalism, I don't think it's totally ad hoc, and I don't think I'm, having to sort of skip ahead and appeal to some kind of Christian resource to get there. So I'm also thinking, what's distinctive about religious disagreement? Why is religious disagreement supposed to be this thing that undermines belief in God? Well, God is supposedly trying to tell us the right answer. It's not like the right interpretation of quantum mechanics or something where it's not like nature is just trying to tell you what's going on. God is trying to tell you the right answer, and somehow it's not clear. God could have communicated in such a way that there was no ambiguity. It was perfectly determinate. There was no confusion at all. God could have done that. It's well within his power to do so. Okay, so that's one distinctive thing about religious disagreement. Another thing that's distinctive about religious disagreement is that the stakes are high. It's not like this is no different from any other disagreement. Like, oh, some people are Platonists, some people are non-Platonists. It's like, no, there are many, many religious believers who think that if you fail to assent to the right proposition, or fail to love the right person, that you will be tortured for all of time. And then you add that to the fact that God is trying to tell us the right answer. He really doesn't want that to happen to you. And somehow he is trying and failing. This omnipotent being he really doesn't want you to go to hell, but he's trying and he just can't manage it. He cannot figure out a way. He literally is the creator of language itself, but he cannot figure out a way to communicate such that there's no confusion, no discord, no disagreement. So, as I mentioned in the debate, I think that if you have a plausible soteriological scheme instead of a ludicrously implausible one, like the idea that you go to hell for all of eternity if you fail to say the not hell words during your lifetime, if you fail to assent to the right proposition, well, eternal torture for you. Like, yeah, once you get over that sort of idea, which has literally no chance of being true, for more on that, you can see my Eternal Conscious Torment video. Which, sorry, just to say, if you believe that idea, it's not necessarily because you're stupid. That came out wrong. I think that the way that people acquire beliefs like that is not through like a careful process of reasoning about the nature of theism and what it might entail, and what it might entail as false. But it's definitely logically incompatible with eternal conscious torment for people who fail to believe the right things about how the universe works. And just to be clear, when I say torment, I mean torment, like torture. I have to clarify. So yeah, most people just kind of inherit that belief, or just, their epistemic authorities and leaders in their community and, trusted figures all kind of say the same thing, and you just kind of accept it semi-uncritically. Or someone points to a passage in the Bible and you're like, well, I gotta believe what the Bible says, or I gotta believe what the church says, or whatever. People do not arrive at this belief through a process of reasoning. Now, if you did, I have much less charitable things to say about you, because I don't understand how this view survives critical scrutiny at all. But for most people, they don't critically scrutinize it. Most people who believe it don't critically scrutinize it. The people who do and somehow still believe it, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound so rude about it, but it's like, it's such a malicious belief. Like it's true. It's not like intellectually defensible, and it's also just kind of abhorrent, so it's hard not to be so disparaging about it, because it's intellectually and morally indefensible. If you could just see what was happening there, if I could somehow show you what's going on in the realm of eternal in the realm of eternal torture overseen by the behooved one, if I could just show you what was going on there for like 10 seconds, it would just immediately become clear how wrong it was. But I mean, that aside, like, you don't have to be morally up in arms about it. You can just think about it logically, which is why I recommended that Eternal Conscious Torment video I made. It's just logically incompatible with theism. Purely in virtue of the meaning of certain words, you can't say something like, a perfectly loving, perfectly just being superintends the eternal torture of conscious creatures. That's literally incoherent. It has nothing to do with being emotional or being compassionate or anything like that. Words mean things, and when you put them together in a certain way, it just turns into incoherent gibberish. So what was I talking about? So once you move towards a more plausible soteriological scheme, then I think that religious disagreement is not as big of a deal, because again, what's distinctive about religious disagreement? Well, the stakes are high. That's why it's so unexpected, I think, on theism, because the stakes are so high and because God is trying to tell you the answer. Okay, well, God's not trying to tell you the answer to Platonism versus nominalism. So why would religious disagreement be any different from Platonism versus nominalism? Well, as best I can tell, it's for those two reasons. God is trying to tell us the right answer, and because the stakes are high. And those two are kind of intertwined. Part of the reason why God is trying to tell us the right answer is because the stakes are high. But once you lower the stakes, and it becomes more like Platonism versus nominalism, then whatever answer you have for why God doesn't reveal to everyone the right answer on that question, it can carry over to this question. I'll just mention really quickly as an aside that I think my thoughts on divine hiddenness might be working in the background here. Because one other reason God might want to reveal himself or make some of the disagreement and discord go away is not just because the stakes are high, but because a relationship with God is a good thing in and of itself. So why are there non-believers who are open to a relationship with God? Well, I think that you can be in a relationship with God without having explicit knowledge of the existence of the person of God or something like that. This is a view defended by Eleanor Stump, for instance, and I think C.S. Lewis. So explicit knowledge that God exists, I don't think is a precondition for a relationship with God. So I don't think anyone is going to be damned as a result of religious disagreement, and I don't think anyone is missing out on a relationship with God properly understood. So I think that religious disagreement is just not truly distinct from other kinds of disagreement. But this is what I mean when I say you can't talk about religious confusion or divine hiddenness without talking about soteriology. What are the stakes? What are the consequences of religious confusion? What is going to predictably follow? So I think once you succeed in eliminating the potential catastrophe that results from religious disagreement, then it just becomes like other disagreements. So if you have an answer to why God allows those sorts of disagreements, then you've got an answer for why God allows people to understand the transcendent and the divine through their own cultural windows and allows there to be some measure of disagreement. So when I talk about stakes, my mind naturally goes to the afterlife, but there's also, the matter of being in a relationship with God, which is supposed to be a good thing. Obviously, I agree that hiddenness is prima facie evidence against theism, because atheism entails this data point, theism does not. So you would expect God to be more apparent, like his existence to be more obvious. Why wouldn't God just be a part of our lives, where if we wanted to verify his existence, it would be possible? That doesn't mean he has to be this constant feature of our daily experience, but just he's not hidden in the way that he's hidden now. But, theists can, of course, explain hiddenness. I'm just a little unconvinced by some of the initial reactions that people have. Oh, well, if God was just apparent, then we would feel that we, didn't really have moral freedom. It's like, okay, well, he doesn't have to be this feature of our daily conscious lives. It's not like God has to always be in the room looking at me. Yeah, that would be weird. Physically, right there. Just eyeballing me, no matter what I'm doing. Yeah, I agree. That would be annoying. But that's not what I'm talking about. God's existence could still be apparent if you went looking for it, but that doesn't mean it has to be persistently a part of your visual field or something like that. I mean, Christians already believe that God is omnipresent and can read their minds. They have no mental privacy. And it's just out of sight, out of mind. And I'm saying the same thing could be true, but you could verify God's existence if you really wanted to. I could verify the existence of Australia if I really wanted to. If I became skeptical, I said, hey, Australia sounds like a fake continent. I'm an Australia truther. Well, Australia is not hidden. I can go verify it, even though it doesn't have to be a part of my daily life. So God could be oh, I don't know, any other person. Really, the only promising response to divine hiddenness that I've ever heard involves the kind of lowering of the stakes that I've been talking about, such that unimaginable catastrophe does not follow as a direct result of God's decision to remain hidden. A worse catastrophe than any nuclear bomb going off as a direct consequence of God choosing to remain hidden. So yeah, you can adopt a soteriological stance such that there is not a catastrophe worse than any nuclear bomb or world war that takes place as a direct consequence of divine hiddenness. You can just do that as a theist. Most of them don't for some reason, but you could. But then there's this additional problem, a relationship with God is supposed to be an intrinsically good thing, something that's just good in and of itself. You're missing out on this valuable thing. We can get into Schellenberg's argument, the specifics of it, of God is perfectly loving. He should be open to a relationship with those who want a relationship with him, or at least those who are not opposed to having a relationship with him. People who have no sort of emotional resistance to God. They just think he doesn't exist. Okay, well, they're missing out on this good thing. And, as I said, we've put in brackets the terrible things that follow from not only the non-belief of atheists and agnostics, but of people who got the wrong religion. I think they should be included as well. If you are this kind of, you have to have the right religion or you go to hell type of believer, which again describes most Christians, I would think. You have to explicitly be a Christian or you go to hell. All right, well, in that case, then the problem extends to Hindus and Muslims and polytheists and Jews and so forth. So, and this directly bears on the whole religious diversity point as well. So it seems like God should be open to a relationship with non-resistant non-believers, which of course includes atheists and agnostics, but also people who think they are in relationship with God, but they're mistaken. They're worshiping, the monkey god Hanuman or Allah or whatever. The point is just they're not actually in a relationship with God. Even people who are totally open to it, and some people who think they are in a relationship with God. Well, the joke's on them. So this is where we get to my spicy take that I mentioned earlier. You can be in a relationship with God without knowing it explicitly. And I sort of attributed this view to C.S. Lewis and Eleanor Stump. Explicit knowledge that God exists, or whatever English word the God of the universe apparently prefers to be called by, may not be a precondition for a relationship with God. Knowing various facts about a person isn't the same thing as having a relationship with that person. So Eleanor Stump gives this example with a neighbor who only knew her as their neighbor and as, so-and-so's mom. And then they went to a philosophy lecture, and who's on stage but their neighbor, Eleanor Stump. And then they came up afterwards and they're like, I had no idea that you were this was your job or whatever. So if you asked the neighbor, do you know any philosophy professors? They would say no. But they did. They just didn't realize it. And if it's possible to think you're in a relationship with God but be mistaken, like the sheep and the goats, then I don't see why the converse couldn't also be true. You could think you're not in a relationship with God but be mistaken. So how is that possible? Well, the good in God are supposed to be convertible. God is love. If you take that at face value, and some of the other proclamations about God and his relationship to the good, then those who pursue the good are pursuing God, according to, for instance, the traditional Christian view. An explicit belief in God is not necessary to be in genuine pursuit of the good, or truth, or beauty, or the highest ideals of love. So if you're living in service to the highest ideals of love, if that's your highest value, if your highest value is the good and truth and beauty and love, then if God is identified with those, then if you're pursuing those values, if you're cultivating those virtues, then you are in a relationship with God, even though you don't have an explicit belief in God. You'd sort of be like Eleanor Stump's neighbor. So you might think this is more hippie nonsense, but you can find traces of this in the Bible, and further, there might be virtues that come about as a result of some people not having an explicit belief in God. I think that even from a theistic perspective, you can imagine why God might create atheists. And this probably doesn't even need to be said at this point, but obviously, whatever value there is to some amount of atheism in the world, or a good amount of religious diversity in the world, is completely swamped by eternal conscious torment or annihilation. If those things are on the table, I really don't know what you could even say that could possibly justify hiddenness and diversity. Because I think there are values to both of those things. I think there are virtues to disagreement, and I think there are virtues to atheism. But if you build in that, people who get the wrong answer, it happens to them. Once you go down that road, the pros are completely swamped by the cons. And because I just know that someone is going to accuse me of assuming consequentialism, no, I'm not. You do not have to be a consequentialist to notice that some things are more valuable than others. Some things are more important than other things. That does not assume consequentialism. My particular soteriological stance, it kind of touches on all these other areas. It relates to how I would try to answer religious disagreement and hiddenness and arguments from evil in some cases. and also, just wanting to have an internally coherent version of theism. So I think there are good reasons to be a universalist, many of which we haven't even begun to talk about. When I'm putting on my theist hat, I do lean towards universalism because it's my backup insurance plan. No, because it's more rational. I mean, I think it does just kind of follow from perfect being theism. It makes more sense to me, and also, I can't deny that it's a little fun to push Christians' buttons like this, because nothing pisses them off faster than suggesting that God might actually save everyone in the end. It's really upsetting to them. So yeah, I think it is more plausible, and that something like on the other end of the spectrum is like literally impossible. But yeah, universalism, it's fun. It's fun to push people's buttons. And I happen to think that if theism is true, it is something like that is probably true anyway. There's a Bob and David sketch about this, Bob Odenkirk and David Cross. It's not Mr. Show, but they had another show, a later sketch show, I think this is where it's from. But yeah, they made like a sketch about how upset Christians would be if universalism turned out to be true.
Boo, Corey, boo!
We will not sit here and have you mock God as some all-forgiving monster.
No way.
Yeah. Get him. Yeah. I think it's illegal what he said, or ought to be. Everyone knows there's a hell. Without a hell, heaven wouldn't be as nice. Shame on him.
So anyway, I don't think this is just a totally ad hoc hypothesis where I'm just like slapping something down on the table that's completely like, okay, perfect being theism plus this other thing that doesn't at all follow from it. I think it just kind of flows from the model. It's not something that is this totally ad hoc thing meant to like, cover my ass or something. So why did I bring all that up? Well, because once you lower the stakes, then I think that it's not as unexpected on theism that there would be religious disagreement. Part of what makes religious disagreement distinctive, part of what distinguishes it from other sorts of intellectual disagreements is that, well, you're fucked if you get the wrong answer. Okay, well, what if there's not going to be a catastrophe if you fail to get the right answer? Well, then religious disagreement becomes like any other disagreement. Because the thing that's really troubling about religious discord and biblical confusion, you can explain a certain amount of disagreement. The thing that you can't really explain is soteriological discord, provided you're not some kind of universalist. Like, the stakes could not be higher. God is trying to tell us the right answer. He's trying to communicate the stakes and the consequences, and it's unclear. Okay, that's just... It's almost as if we have a vast series of buttons in front of us, and if you press the wrong one, you end up tortured for trillions upon trillions of years, and if you press the other one, you don't, and then God was not really clear about which button you're supposed to push. Okay, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. So once you lower the stakes and you have a soteriological scheme where that's just not really on the table, there's no button you can press that results in you being tormented for all of eternity, then yeah, I think that what makes religious disagreement distinctive kind of fades away. Furthermore, there are different kinds of disagreement. Like, there are things that are mere differences, about like how we want to live. Do we want to worship on Saturday or on Sunday? Or are they like core disagreements? And by core disagreement, I mean something that actually matters, like something where if you get the wrong answer, catastrophe will follow. But yeah, once you eliminate that whole catastrophic option, then things look more like mere differences and less like core disagreements. Yeah, so it's not as surprising, I think, that different religious believers would see God through their own cultural windows, that there would be unique cultural expressions of their godlike beliefs. That becomes less surprising once you enter the liberal hippie realm that I'm kind of outlining here. But look, you could spend your whole life reading about different religions and trying to resolve every disagreement, and you could not. You could not do it. There would be religions you haven't heard of. There would be disagreements that could not be settled. So, if you believe that God is perfectly loving and just, then presumably he has reasons to permit these disagreements while maintaining his status as perfectly loving and just. So what might those reasons be? Again, why does God allow disagreements about anything? Well, because most of those disagreements are not going to result in unimaginable catastrophe. So that clears the way. Again, once you get these less plausible soteriological models just off the table, then you can talk about the value of disagreement. So, for instance, disagreement among smart people breeds humility. When I find out there are people who I respect, who I think are intelligent, who think different things than I do, it makes me feel more humble about my beliefs. I think it enriches life in general, and it generates excitement. This is something that Christopher Hitchens talked about, where he said he was extremely drunk in the back of a car. It's been a really long time since I've seen this video, but he said something like he wouldn't want everyone to deconvert because it would take away this fun intellectual sparring match. So it generates excitement, it enriches life, it breeds humility, it leads to a process of growth. It leads to a process of arriving at truth rather than just being programmed to already know the right answer. Is that like what the people who are raising religious disagreement, like, is that what they expect if theism is true, that God would just create a bunch of clones with identical beliefs where we all are just pre-programmed to believe the right answer? I see no reason to think that would be the case. I think that there's value to disagreement. And of course, all of that I just mentioned is trivial in comparison to eternal hell or annihilation. But once we get over these views, universalism opens the way to explain disagreement. So without universalism, religious disagreement, particularly soteriological disagreement, is inexcusable and, I would think, a devastating objection. So again, this is something I said right at the beginning. When you change your model, when you change your worldview, evidence does not have the same impact. So you can't just say, oh, it doesn't matter if you're a universalist or you believe in eternal conscious torment. Religious disagreement packs the same evidential punch against both of them. Sorry, but that doesn't make any sense. Religious disagreement, in particular soteriological... Well, look, the fact that there is soteriological disagreement is evidence for naturalism. For sure. Because there are way more people who are not universalists, right? So, but I haven't really been talking about that. I'm just talking about religious disagreement, because people typically don't specify soteriological disagreement. That's something that, as far as I can tell, is kind of unique to me, where I think that that specific argument is like a devastating objection that really supports naturalism. The fact that people don't agree on how to get salvation, or, you know, the nature of salvation, like, that I think is a big problem. And the only way I can make sense of that when I put my theist hat on is that, something like universalism is true. But regardless, it is still evidence. Soteriological disagreement is evidence favoring naturalism. But if we're just zooming out and talking about religious disagreement more generally, those sorts of differences, I think, there's value to disagreement. And once you lower the stakes, then those values, those virtues of disagreement, actually become worth something, to the point that I think they totally could justify and explain religious disagreement. So just to loop all the way back around to the whole widespread theistic belief phenomenon to begin with, belief in God was produced by generally truth-tracking human faculties far more often than it wasn't, and its likelihood is raised as a matter of probability since most of the beliefs that are held by most people are true. I think that still holds up, and I don't think it's really undermined by religious disagreement, the consensus of experts, the appeal to popularity fallacy earlier on. You know, I'm just walking away thinking that this is still a good argument. But maybe I'm missing something. Again, I would love to be set straight on this, but for the time being, I'm still thinking that widespread theistic belief is evidence favoring theism. Again, maybe you think it's really weak evidence, but I'm still thinking that it's evidence favoring theism. So, religious experience. I'm not sure if this really fits into the cumulative case model. You know, I guess you could say, yeah, it's more likely that people would have religious experiences if there is a genuine transcendent reality. If there is no genuine transcendent reality, then why would you expect people throughout different cultures, different times to report having transcendent experiences? That's not really the angle that I took. My angle is just, hey, if you've had an experience of God, then you're rational in believing in God. Maybe the evidential case for atheism could overcome that, but it would have to be a pretty powerful evidential case. So yeah, this sort of argument is defensive. It's not really intended to convince anyone else. It's just saying that those who have had the experience are rational in taking their experiences at face value until they're given a really good reason to not take them at face value. So yes, this is very defensive, but one other potential question about this sort of argument is, how many people have actually had that sort of experience? Maybe it's not a visual experience exactly, but it's something where I just appear to be experiencing God, like I'm being appeared to in some way by God in experience. How many people actually have that experience? Certainly not everyone who goes to church, Certainly not everyone who's a theist. But, okay, so maybe those are potential shortcomings, but even though it's defensive, even though it only describes a subset of believers, it's still the case that if it seems to you that you're being appeared to by God, then in the absence of defeaters, it's entirely rational for you to believe so. In the same way that if you were accused of a crime on the basis of convincing publicly available evidence, but you remember where you were that day, you don't remember committing any crime, you can trust that you didn't do it just on the basis of your memory. There's some stuff in the background about you don't black out for periods of time. You have generally trustworthy faculties and so on. Okay, well, even if the public evidence against you is convincing, shouldn't really persuade you, right? Just on the basis of your internal seemings. You've got these memory seemings, and that evidence is not defeated by the public evidence against you, even if it's like, oh, you were picked out of a lineup by a few different people, and there's video evidence of this guy who kind of looks like you. There's eyewitness testimony. Your fingerprints were at the scene. None of that is going to convince you. You're like, hey man, I remember where I was, and I think I would have remembered committing this crime. Sort of a side point here, which I wish more people would internalize, is that even though the publicly available evidence is the same for everyone, we occupy different positions on the grand epistemic landscape. So we can come to opposite conclusions with the same rational faculties. So we have the same ability to assess the evidence, we have the same evidence, we've come to opposite conclusions, and we're both rational. Something in line with this is a passage from The Varieties of Religious Experience from William James, where I think he exposes a kind of epistemic double standard held among skeptics of mystical experiences. So let me just read this long quote. I wish I had time to read this during the debate, but mystical states, when well developed, usually are, and have the right to be, absolutely authoritative over the individuals to whom they come. Our own more rational beliefs are based on evidence exactly similar in nature to that which mystics quote for theirs. Our senses, namely, have assured us of certain states of fact, but mystical experiences are as direct perceptions of fact for those who have them as any sensations ever were for us. The records show that even though the five senses be in abeyance in them, they are absolutely sensational in their epistemological quality. Yet, I repeat once more, the existence of mystical states absolutely overthrows the pretension of non-mystical states to be the sole and ultimate dictators of what we may believe. It is the rationalistic critic, rather, who plays the part of denier in the controversy, and his denials have no strength, for there never can be a state of facts to which new meaning may not truthfully be added, provided the mind ascend to a more enveloping point of view. It must always remain an open question, whether mystical states may not possibly be such superior points of view, windows through which the mind looks out upon a more extensive and inclusive world. The difference of the views seen from the different mystical windows need not prevent us from entertaining this supposition. The wider world would, in that case, prove to have a mixed constitution, like that of this world. That is all. End quote. So yeah, he's making, I think, a sort of phenomenal conservative point there. And he says, these religious experiences, these mystical experiences, are sensational in their epistemological quality. I don't think he was saying they're sensational. They have to do with sensation of hearing, seeing, etc. So yeah, it's like you have these seemings, and that's what informs your belief about the external world generally. And people who have mystical experiences say, hey, I think this stuff is a part of the wider world. So there seems to be sort of a double standard here. It's like, oh, that doesn't count. Well, why not? It's the same type of evidence. And he points out, like, you can always learn more about the world. We're probably never going to be at an end point. And then at the very end, he brings up the point about disagreement. Quote, the differences of the views seen from different mystical windows need not prevent us from entertaining this supposition. The wider world would in that case prove to have a mixed constitution like that of this world. That is all. So yeah, people have disagreements about this world, and people have disagreements about the transcendent reality. But there is disagreement about, quote-unquote ordinary reality. So why is this of unique concern in the religious arena? And besides, maybe they're all right. Maybe the wider world just has a mixed constitution like that of this world. And I think it's also worth taking into account the difficulty of expressing some of these truths in language. I think there are genuinely ineffable truths, things that are true that really can't be said. When you have these mystical experiences and try to talk about them, it's very difficult. And I think anyone who's taken any strong hallucinogens can attest to this. Or just, if you have any kind of transcendent experience and you try to explain it, it never really does justice to the experience, And I think this makes sense, like from an evolutionary perspective, because consciousness arose before language. My cats almost certainly have a private, subjective point of view. They have an inner mental life. I don't think they have language. They have very crude forms of communication, but they don't have language like as we define it with human beings. Regardless of your views about philosophy of mind, it's pretty clear, I think, that non-human animals are conscious, even though they don't have language. So it stands to reason that consciousness came about before language. So it makes sense to me that there would be states of consciousness that are ineffable. Truths that you can see and experience, but can't express in language. I think given the fact that consciousness is so much older than language, I think that adds up. So then people have these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and then they just kind of fail to communicate their significance with language. And then when they try, there appear to be all these surface-level conflicts. Yeah, I just don't think that's really great evidence, because these states of consciousness are notoriously hard to articulate in language. They seem genuinely ineffable. They cannot be effed. And when you try to eff them, it comes out sounding kind of stupid. Maybe not stupid, but just like trite, like people will come out like, everything is love. Why don't you go stitch that on a pillow, and I'm going to get back to my life now. There are truths that you appreciate, and you try to write them down. It just doesn't translate. Anyway, so the fact that when people try to express them in language, there are these prima facie conflicts. There are two responses to that. One, the wider world might just have a mixed constitution, like that of this world. And secondly, the fact that these truths seem largely ineffable, I think could explain the apparent conflicts when people try to express them. But, God could have made religious experiences determinate and unambiguous, such that there was no confusion at all. We already talked about this in the section about religious disagreement, but, which disagreements? Are they mere differences, or are they core disagreements? Like what are the stakes? Does it really matter if people disagree about this? Why is it unexpected exactly? But I think some people have transcendent experiences, and they're not really of God per se. They're just transcendent experiences, and they get classified as mystical or religious. So, of the religious disagreements that are relevant here, that are not mere differences, that seem to give people conflicting information about which God exists and what he wants from us. So different prophets, for instance. Again, I think that certain religious believers will have resources for this that others don't. So if you wanted to skip ahead and be like, okay, what kind of religious believer are you? Because some of them are not really going to have a hard time with this. Others will definitely. And as I said, I don't think this is purely just skipping ahead. I think that you can kind of derive certain clues about the afterlife and soteriology from perfect being theism itself. So, two potential defeaters. One is just that the evidential case is so overwhelming. The other is religious disagreement. Spent a lot of time on that one. previously. There are two other objections to religious experience that I wanted to mention. One is about our hyperactive agency detection device. Can that explain religious experience? So, yeah, I mean, that can explain some religious experiences, but it's kind of implausible to think that this can explain all religious experiences. It's only a subset of religious experiences that don't go beyond mere agency detection. And that's what this can explain. It can explain agency detection, even if there is no agent. Okay, fair enough. And I actually have a friend who just wrote a long paper about hyperactive agency detection. And I plan on having him on the show to talk about cognitive science of religion and psychology of religion, probably in the next few months. He actually has a channel, I forgot, Naturalism Next. They only have one video so far, but it's a good video. Anyway, I asked him this question, and he agreed that it can explain some, but not all, religious experiences. And further, our agency detection, it's not like it always misfires. It's accurate more often than not, way more often than not. So maybe it's misfiring when we experience God. So just take the experiences that can be explained through our hyperactive agency detection. Okay, well, how do we know it's actually, being hypersensitive in that context? Like, maybe it's misfiring when we experience God, but maybe it's not. It could be working just as it's designed to work. I think when I first started talking about this sort of thing a few years ago, I sort of thought that the mere existence of this hyperactive agency detection device, I was like, oh, well, that just settles it. Because we both believe in this thing. Theists and naturalists both agree that this thing exists. How many times have you mistakenly thought there was an agent, creeping around your house or your apartment or something? You hear a noise and you're like, is someone outside the window? Oh, is someone in the apartment? Even if you don't really think that that's true, you can't help but think it. And if you're like me, you can't help but get up and just check. And non-human animals have this same thing. I remember Dennett giving this example of, snow falling off his roof and his dog flipping out and thinking there's an intruder. It's like, yeah, everyone has this. Or conversely, how many times have you failed to notice an agent? If someone's sufficiently camouflaged or if you just didn't notice them. The point is that your agency detection device does not work perfectly. Sometimes it misfires, sometimes it fails to fire. It fires when there's no agent, doesn't fire when there is an agent. Most of the time it works, but it's not perfect. And once we know that this thing exists, and theists should of course concede that this thing exists, this phenomenon or this module or whatever, then it's like, okay, well, you grant that we could explain at least some religious experiences like this. Well, then this is kind of the simpler explanation, isn't it? Because we both already have this as a part of our ontology, and once you grant that it can explain the data, then you're kind of adding these explanatorily redundant postulates, that are not really adding anything. So maybe that would be the argument. Another objection, and I skipped over this one during the debate because I've seen this sort of thing mentioned in conversation, but I can't imagine it's been defended. I mean, who knows? I've seen so many silly things about neuroscience and consciousness. I wouldn't put it past someone to try to do this, but I mostly just hear it in conversation, oh, well, neuroscientists can explain this part of the brain is active, when you're having a religious experience. We can put you in the God helmet and have a religious experience. Doesn't that just prove it, that it's all just fake? So, can neuroscience explain religious experiences? So I'm just going to read this part that I had written. Skeptics will sometimes appeal to neural correlates of religious experiences, pointing out with varying degrees of specificity that the brain is active while these religious experiences take place. What seems implicit here is the following line of reasoning. Because these experiences were chemically mediated, they can't be trusted. So that's obviously wrong because all your experiences are chemically mediated. Yes, there are neural correlates to religious experience, but presenting the neural correlates of a perceived tree does not imply the tree is a hallucination. All your thoughts, everything you think, every line of reasoning you follow, all sense data that come in, all of your experiences are neurologically mediated in some sense. No one denies it, and certainly some of your experiences have epistemic credibility. The argument that neurologically mediated states of consciousness cannot be truth tracking is not just incorrect. Your thought that providing the neural basis of religious experience would debunk those experiences is also chemically mediated and can also be described neurologically. So appeals to neuroscience of this sort are nonsensical and self-defeating. So, imagine if instead of a God helmet, I had a helmet that could make you think neuroscience debunks religious experiences. I mean, would that debunk the argument that, it's just a self-defeating view that, once we understand the neural correlates of this view, it proves that it's not true. Once I can show the neural correlates of a tree, it proves the tree is just a hallucination. Once I can show the neural correlates of, making this argument, then I prove that the argument is actually a bad argument. It's self-defeating. And, it just doesn't make any sense. All of your experiences are neurologically mediated. And as I said, no one denies it, not even dualists. No one denies that, in some sense, your inner world is neurologically mediated. It's a very vague statement, It's compatible with all different views. And some of your experiences have epistemic credibility. So just because there are neural correlates, that fact does precisely nothing to undermine the veridicality of the experiences. So Felipe Leon developed this argument. He has a list of 100 arguments against God or something like that. And this is on the list, the phenomenon of anti-religious experience. I buy into phenomenal conservatism, so to quote a certain apologist, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I have no epistemic double standard here. I think that religious experience and irreligious experience provide prima facie evidence supporting their respective conclusions. As I mentioned earlier, I think we can occupy different positions on the epistemic landscape. So what is irreligious or anti-religious experience? I think it'd be best just to show an example. So this is from a Holocaust survivor, quoted in Brenner, The Faith and Doubt of Holocaust Survivors, page 110. Quote, "This is what I think. We were sent forth by humanity, by mankind, although it was not even aware it was doing so, to find out once and for all if there's a God. That's the meaning of the camps. It was meant to bring him out into the open if he existed at all. Nothing else or less significant could have brought him out into the open, to respond, to act, and to show his face. It was a stupendous test, unconscious and unintentional, but a test nevertheless. And God failed the test and proved his own non-existence. And I, as a part of the experiment, stopped believing in him altogether. Just as certain laboratory experiments are conclusive and incontrovertible, so was this. If he wouldn't come out then, during those times, when? Now, when man writes his history, he can say there was a vast laboratory experiment conducted by man during the 1940s to see if there is a God or not. The conclusion was no God exists. There were guinea pigs in the test and other kinds of experimental animals, but mainly guinea pigs. Jews, of course. I know, I was one of them." End quote. So, lots of people experience the absence of God, or things that entail the non-existence of God. There might be evils that no being would be morally permitted to allow if it was within their power to prevent them, just intrinsically impermissible. So if one has prima facie justification for believing that evils of this kind have taken place in our world, then they have prima facie justification for believing that God doesn't exist, since the existence of intrinsically impermissible evils entails the non-existence of God, at least the kind of God that I outlined near the beginning. Felipe Leon argued that the experiences that many people have, being overwhelmed by the apparent realization that reality is a cold and uncaring place, indifferent to their welfare, that those experiences are more likely on the hypothesis of indifference, since on the hypothesis of indifference, that's true. But on theism, those belief-triggering experiences are surprising, since we'd expect God to design our cognitive faculties to reliably generate accurate beliefs about reality, for one, but also because those experiences of divine silence and hiddenness prevent many of those people from having a relationship with God, so the belief-triggering experiences are misleading them. Their cognitive faculties appear to be misleading them. They're inaccurately reflecting reality in a way that drives a wedge between them and God. So the experience of the absence of God and the indifference of the universe, according to Leon, provides at least some confirming evidence for indifference over theism. But more pertinent to the way that I've been presenting religious experience, the experience of the absence of God arguably is on par epistemically with the experience of God. Sarah Adams and John Robson argued exactly this in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. To quote William James, these irreligious states have the right to be absolutely authoritative over the individuals to whom they come, and these irreligious experiences are as direct perceptions of fact for those who have them as any sensations ever were for us. It might seem like an almost mystical apprehension of a higher truth about the world, the appearance of which is so powerful it would require a strong evidential case to overcome. Okay, so there does seem to be a sort of parity here. And I don't bring this up as like a defeater for religious experience, by the way. I'm just pointing out that atheists have the same kind of resources at their disposal. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting question whether anti-religious experiences are permitted to have the same authority over those who have them. So there are a few different ways to go about the argument from anti-religious experience. One is to take it as a small bit of confirming evidence. Another is the apprehension of an event or events that entail the non-existence of God. And it could also be more direct, an experience of the absence of God that has a sort of epistemic parity with the experience of God. So, I swear I'll get back to defending atheism after this. I will say that the last couple weeks, and even the last couple months, have been good for me. I think it's a good idea to step into the theist's shoes for longer than 10 minutes. But anyway, you're not going to catch me saying silly things like, there is no evidence for theism, or something like that. Like, really, there's nothing in our world that theism assigns a higher probability to than naturalism. There's nothing that is perhaps slightly unexpected on your worldview, but less unexpected on a theist's. There's not one thing. Anyway, the point is that an atheist can admit that there's some evidence for theism. I'm an atheist because I think it's swamped by the evidence for atheism, particularly by arguments from evil. And by the way, a great litmus test, it's not perfect, but a litmus test for whether a theist is worth listening to or not is whether they admit that evil is evidence against theism. If a theist can't admit that there's any evidence against their position, then that is a sure sign that they're not worth listening to. If you don't think there's any evidence against your position, I don't know, what are the odds of that being true? It seems more likely that maybe you just haven't really considered the other position. You haven't really tried to empathize with that point of view. That seems like maybe a better explanation than your worldview is literally perfect and there's no evidence against it. So let's just sum up the four main arguments we've discussed. We've tried to answer a few atheistic arguments along the way, like divine hiddenness and religious confusion, and I've kind of surprised myself with some of the conclusions I've come to exploring those two issues. But there are four arguments I made in defense of theism. So first, the existence of consciousness. I think this argument works, but only constitutes weak evidence in favor of theism. And that seems to be the general verdict among people who don't try to maintain that the evidence is understated in this case. Second, psychophysical harmony. I think this argument works and is good evidence for theism. I'm not going to lie, I think this evidence is actually kind of strong. I'm holding out for someone to come and offer devastating objections, and maybe as time goes on, I'll see some angle that I missed at first. But for now, it seems like I'm finally being forced to take spooky naturalism more seriously. I don't just mean rejecting physicalism, because as you probably know, I've been there for a long time, but I mean accepting something like Thomas Nagel's natural teleology. That was always a passing interest of mine, but if I take this argument seriously, I think I'm being forced to adopt something like natural teleology and actively defend it. So naturalism can live on, but it's possible that the real debate is not between theism and something like the hypothesis of indifference. Well, I mean, maybe that's not exactly right, because a lot of people sort of define indifference based on vibes, and they don't really look at the actual definition of it that was given by Draper, for instance, in his Pain and Pleasure article. Like here, let me read how he defines it. Neither the nature nor the condition of sentient beings on Earth is the result of benevolent or malevolent actions performed by non-human persons. So even if you accept natural teleology, that's not really a violation of the letter of the hypothesis of indifference as defined by Draper there. But it is clearly a violation of the spirit of it. Anyway, this is another discussion. The point is, I think it's entirely possible that the real debate is not between theism and something like ordinary naturalism. Third, widespread theistic belief, or the common consent argument. So I think this argument works, but is not that strong at the end of the day. But I think it succeeds in a unique way, where other arguments for theism typically fail. I think it should get us to take theism seriously just on its own. It should certainly prevent any rational person from seriously comparing God to Santa Claus or Harry Potter or something, let alone calling religion a mental illness. It's not that the argument is so strong that we ought to take theism seriously, it's like the specific subject matter of the argument that has this effect. I think one reason this argument feels different is because we're saying evidence of evidence is evidence. And of course it is. I mean, it seems like any appeal to the consensus of experts is the same kind of thing. You're not really appealing directly to the evidence. You're appealing to evidence of the evidence. There are probably many times when you don't actually look into the evidence yourself, but just rely on the reports and the testimony of people who you think have the relevant training and ability to assess the evidence. And sometimes it's not even the consensus of people with relevant expertise, but just trusted authorities. Yeah, so I think it feels a little different for most people because we're not saying, hey, look at this apparent teleology or contingency, and then trying to argue to God from there. We're appealing to a phenomenon that's kind of dependent on human beings. Yeah, it makes some people uncomfortable, but I think the kind of hand-waving responses to it are terrible. And I think some of the incredulity that this argument is met with comes down to an excessively pessimistic view about human rationality and the wisdom of crowds. People are not idiots. It might feel good to think that or say that, but it's not true. Anyway, it's hard to know how to weigh this evidence exactly, but I think it is evidence, I think it does work, and the peculiarities of the subject matter at least have this effect on me where it's like, I feel like I should take theism seriously, purely as a result of the fact that most people do. And finally, religious experience. So I've been on the record for years at this point saying that if someone has a sufficiently compelling experience of God, there's just not much the atheist can say. And of course, very few have the kind of overwhelming experiences that would give someone the same confidence in God as my hypothetical defendant who knows on the basis of their memory that they didn't commit the crime they're accused of, even though the publicly available evidence against them is rather strong. If a theist finds themselves in that sort of position, then they're rational to believe in God. But for the, I would guess, vast majority of religious believers who don't have that kind of experience of God, you're stuck with me over here in cumulative case land. Speaking of the cumulative case, that's part of why I wanted to do this in the first place. I wanted to make it clearer both to atheists and theists listening to this show that this is how the debate tends to proceed. The best argument for theism isn't an argument, but a cumulative case, and the same goes for atheism. A cumulative case that examines as much of the relevant evidence as possible is the best defense of atheism. For about a year and a half at this point, ever since a little before the episode about Paul Draper's case for naturalism against William Lane Craig, that's the general approach I've been taking, and about a year ago I explained why I'm an atheist in these terms, along with a few additional reasons. So I tried to do a similar thing for theism, though not nearly as comprehensive, if nothing else to show how I think the dialectic ought to go. I think people like Draper and Swinburne gave us a good template. And I've very much enjoyed it, but I'm ready to finally hang up my theist hat and go back to serving Satan. One disclaimer, I did not make a comprehensive case for theism. This is not the total evidence that favors theism. It's just the stuff that was most interesting to me and struck me as the most defensible. Two things I didn't defend. First was the contingency argument, which I think is really interesting, but I think there's a general failure of stage 2 arguments. You know, the part where you actually get to God. And the second argument that I didn't bring up that I think is good is a moral knowledge argument. It's pretty much the only moral argument for theism that's worth anything. It concedes that atheists can be moral realists, believe in objective morality, but that it's hard to account for how we have moral knowledge. So say that you conceive of knowledge as justified true belief, just for the sake of argument. How do we come to have justified true beliefs in moral facts if we're just the product of natural evolutionary forces that seemingly have no tendency to put us in touch with these strange moral facts? Anyway, maybe there will be an episode about that, or a debate, perhaps. And there are other more minor arguments. Anyway, I chose the 4 that I chose because I think that they're interesting and defensible. Arguing for something that goes beyond theism, that goes beyond the existence of something godlike, I have no idea. I wouldn't even know how to go about that. I mean, argue like for the resurrection or something, like, I don't even think I could do that. I don't think I could do a devil's advocate defense of the resurrection. I mean, I don't think I could do it in good faith. I couldn't do it like how I just defended theism, where I actually mean the things that I'm saying. So the past couple weeks, I've been trying to take up the theist's perspective, and not just when I was planning out the content of the debate in these episodes, like really trying to see the world through a theistic lens. What would it be like to believe in God? I haven't been a Christian for years at this point. Trying to take up that perspective again has been interesting for many reasons. I've come away with more respect for theism, but it's also made me appreciate atheism a bit more. What atheism offers became clearer to me when I tried to walk a mile in the theist's shoes. And that's one thing I'm working on next, exploring what atheism offers. Not just trivial things like not having to get up or go anywhere on Sundays. Maybe that's not so trivial, but you know what I mean. What does atheism offer? So I think now is as good a time as any to bid farewell to Theist Emerson. It was fun while it lasted, but it must come to an end. This cannot go on. There is evidence for theism, but there's more evidence for atheism, particularly in the form of arguments from evil. So there's some evidence for the idea that God exists. There's more evidence for the idea that God doesn't exist. Though I can't lie, I think that the argument from Psychophysical Harmony in particular has raised my credence in theism higher than it was before. I mentioned this on Twitter and I think it annoyed some people, but it happens to be true. If it weren't for arguments from evil, I would just be an agnostic at this point. I think there are some good arguments for atheism that can get you to think that the evidence is roughly counterbalanced, which would make you an agnostic. And I think if you just put in brackets arguments from evil, then I think the evidence is roughly counterbalanced. So yeah, if it weren't for the problem of evil, I would be an agnostic. The thing that really pushes me over the edge would be the various arguments from evil. If you enjoy this content, if you find it valuable, please consider supporting it at patreon.com/counter. Or if you like the stuff that's more about consciousness and less related to religion, you can go to patreon.com/Walden Pod. You can also just tell people about the podcast or the channel. That's very helpful, or leave a review on iTunes or Spotify. So thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I will talk to you next time.